Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Yeah, this is a great crowd to see so early in the morning. You really must be security fans to get up this early to talk about something as exciting as security on Surface. I'll introduce myself. I'm Frank Buchholz. I lead technical marketing on the Surface commercial marketing team.
And I am Jacob Rhoades. I lead technical skilling and readiness and some demo stuff for that same team. Love telling stories about security and management and lots of other things as they relate to our devices.
Yeah. So let's get right into it. We want to be here today to talk about Surface. We feel strongly about Surface and the idea that Surface is not just a piece of hardware that Microsoft builds. It is a single solution that Microsoft builds that is a platform for running every single piece of software that we can think of, from Windows to Office to other pieces within there, Dynamics, you name it, it runs on Surface. 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 reminded me this morning of an expression that we have in Surface, that all problems are Surface problems. Essentially, if you have an issue with the Surface device, there's only one number to call, and that's Microsoft. Whether we're talking about the firmware of the device, the operating system of the device, the management of the device, all these pieces come together to essentially build a story around one unique solution. There's only a couple other products that I can even think of that are out in the world in the computer industry that one vendor essentially makes an entire solution. I do think of like the Pixel phone from Google, where they provide not only the device, but they also provide the firmware and the operating system and also the management tools that go on that. And think of Surface in the same line. I would even say if you looked at Apple, Apple does many of those things, but at the management level, they rely on other partners of theirs in order to provide that. And they even provide essentially that 𝗦𝗲𝗀 on some of their pieces for that BIOS comes from outside of their own organization as well. But the unique thing about Surface is whether we're talking about the chips that are on the device, we're talking about the firmware, we're talking about the operating system and the drivers, or the management tools, as well as all of the applications and from pen and touch and all those other unique experiences, it is in whole a Microsoft product. And so we want to make sure if there's one thing you take away from that, it's the idea that this is a single product all put together by Microsoft.
So are we sending them all away now? That's the one
it.
thing? Or?
That's it. That's the only thing you need to
I
remember today.
Maybe this one's important too. We got some stuff too.
Yeah, the other thing we want to nail out is there's essentially a red thread of truth throughout all of our products. All of our products essentially have the ability, when you turn them on and go into, I'll say our devices have essentially two different operating systems. There's the 𝗦𝗲𝗀, which is a modern BIOS of the device that essentially helps to boot the device. And then there's the Windows operating system that we all know and love. But along that line, the core of a Surface device is that 𝗦𝗲𝗀. It is essentially a piece of code or a piece of firmware that Microsoft has developed and written. And it's actually an open firmware, meaning that you can actually go in and inspect it. It's all based on this idea of Project 𝗦𝗀, M-U. And you can go see that this was a consortium of effort from Microsoft as an open source project to build this 𝗦𝗲𝗀 that essentially helps to boot the device, but also helps maintain the security of the device. Each one of these devices you see here, whether it's our smallest Go 4 or a 10-inch device that's really built for more frontline and education and people that just want a smaller form factor, even all the way up through the Surface Hub, a product that is near and dear to my heart. And by the way, we have another Surface Hub session all the way at the end of the day, so make sure you come see us there. But the Surface Hub, also running Windows 11 at its core, has that same 𝗦𝗲𝗀 that's essentially built into it. And we're going to dive into what that 𝗦𝗲𝗀 means as we talk about our story here. So Jacob, do you want to kind of set what we talk about when we think about these layers?
Yes, I would love to. So when we think about secure devices by Microsoft, we think about this concept that our devices are built secure and trusted at every layer to protect users and data with ultimate control. And that's kind of the framework that we're going to go through as we drill into some of these topics a little bit. So the first one being that built secure. This is that first pillar. And these really give end users and IT peace of mind. From design to delivery, we're built for security. They're designed according to zero trust principles. with an end-to-end secure supply chain with enterprise-ready compliance. So what does that zero trust principle really mean? Think of it as, these secure components, they're designed to minimize those attack surfaces. And we're assuming compromise at one of those layers. And when you assume compromise, you don't have any of those layers trust the other layers. And so that's a key tenet of Microsoft security in general, and we implement that in our Surface devices in many, many various ways. So I love just landing on that. Frank, I think let's talk about the supply chain a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a big part of it is, when we design the product itself, we also have to think about the manufacturing of the product. One of the big pieces that goes into this is essentially understanding what are the components that are going to go into this. What's going to go into the board itself? What is the chipsets? How do we inspect those different components along the line? We put a lot of effort into essentially detecting and looking for any threats and anything we absorb into our supply chain before we put it into the device. We have the ability to inspect all of those and understand essentially what is the bill of materials of the software itself that we put into the device, and then how do we build that device and inspect it throughout its chain. But at one point, we're going to have to put the operating system onto the device, and how do we ensure the trust of the flow of that operating system coming from Microsoft onto a Microsoft piece of hardware in a Microsoft maintained and essentially manufacturing facility wherever it is across the globe where we manufacture these devices. And then how do we also ensure that when the device is booted for the first time, we can ensure that there's not been any tampering along the way, whether that's through packaging, whether that's through using the TPM chip and essentially putting checksums of each of the pieces of firmware that are booted when the device is booted are all kept within the TPM. That is essentially our trusted vault that we can keep these secrets in so that nobody can get to them. All of these things help ensure that this device is essentially secure and built in that particular fashion. So if we want to go ahead and just, the other piece, as we talked about here, we talked about that bill of materials and essentially how do we essentially inspect even our vendors' software that we inherit or we place onto ours, whether that's firmware or other pieces, but it's also the compliance that we put in. We've made huge investments over the years in order to make sure that we comply with all of the executive orders and NIST and other types of capabilities that certify our devices as trusted into these different frameworks. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So for us here, it's really about that concept, as Jacob had landed, that we think of this as a layered approach. And what we're going to do first is we're actually going to jump into those layers. We're going to jump in. I was a computer science major, maybe some of you too, and if you remember that IP stack idea, that if you start at the firmware and the hardware layer and you start working your way up through the operating system and application and cloud, that's essentially the approach that we take on the Surface device as well. That old IP stack is still true as towards how do we think about the security of our devices as well. And the baseline of that is what we call this 𝗦𝗲𝗍. And I'm actually going to show you a little bit of a demonstration of this 𝗦𝗲𝗍. But the 𝗦𝗲𝗍 is essentially on any Surface device, if you were to hit the power button and also hit the volume up key, it will take you into this UEFI. The UEFI, again, is a modern version of our BIOS. But it's granular in nature. We have the capability to go into the devices section and actually use it as a way to turn elements on or off. As Jacob stated, there's an ability to essentially reduce the attack surface, to play on words, of the device. And what I love about that is the idea that if this device is going to be used as a kiosk, maybe you should turn Bluetooth off on the device. If the device is going to be used essentially in a secured environment, maybe you're not going to have cameras on the device. One of the biggest ones that I love to point out is the ability to turn off the ability to boot from USB. What does that mean? That essentially means that if you hand this, I always like to use this example of saying, hey, if I handed this to a student and they get on Reddit and say, how do I install Linux on my Surface device? Then essentially being able to take this USB key and stick it into your Surface device and try to boot off of it, if your organization has changed that setting to turn off the ability to boot from USB, you're not going to be able to re-image it with a USB key. You're going to have to re-image it either over the cloud, through Intune or other ways, and that means essentially your IT department can manage and reboot and re-image the device, but the user cannot. And what I love about this is you can enroll these devices into Intune and deploy them through autopilot, and then you can lock the UEFI so that only the system administrator or that person that is managing the tenant that these devices belong to has that ability to essentially make any changes to this UEFI. And so we'll go through a couple of different settings and other pieces that I'll showcase in here. And I think is the next piece, the other piece is also to talk about SEM. Now, for many people that are still deploying their devices through Gold Image or using essentially SCCM or System Center Manager, if you still want to have that granular control that we offer through, I'll show you this capability to manage it through Intune, but if you're not using Intune and using more SCCM, then SEM is the tool for you. It essentially gives you granular control down to that UEFI level to turn those elements off and on in order for you to manage it. And I love this tool as a way in order to accomplish that. But within DFCI, I'm going to showcase the DFCI, and rather than kind of run through this particular slide, I'd rather just go ahead and show you a demo.
That sounds like a great idea to me, Frank.
So we're going to, let me go ahead and get my device ready here. And so let's go ahead and hit 2. So we're in here in the UEFI itself. And so this is the UEFI of a Surface device. And so one of the things that you'll notice is I have the ability to have granular control over that device. When I turn something off at the firmware level, that's almost like stopping electricity from going into that particular component, so that when you actually boot the device and you go into Device Manager, that functionality will not even show up on the device. And so for me, I could actually come in and say, hey, I'd rather turn the front camera off, maybe the rear camera, maybe the IR camera on the device. And then what I want to be able to do is just make sure I have a secure boot enabled on the device. And then I want to be able to ensure that I have the Windows Boot Manager listed correctly. Maybe I want to be able to turn off that ability to boot from USB. But when I'm done, I can go ahead and hit Exit. Now, this would be essentially the way I, as a local user, would want to be able to manage this. But what I really want to get into is more the ability to show you this interesting tool that we call DFCI, or Device Firmware Configuration Interface. So this would essentially mean that one of the things that I could do is log into my Azure Active Directory Intune environment and be able to administer that spot. So here I am in the Intune Admin Center, and within the Intune Admin Center, one of the things I can do is I can actually create what's called a DFCI profile. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to choose Windows 10 or later. I'm going to go ahead and choose to have a particular template, and one of those templates is, you'll see, is Device Firmware Configuration Interface. And so under here, I can actually go ahead and create this. I can give it a name, and I can go ahead and be able to see, now I have these settings. Now, these settings are going to look a lot like those settings of what we saw in the Surface UEFI. And so now one of the things that I can do is I can come in here and say, I only want the essentially local user to make any changes to things that I have not changed. So meaning that I could say you can't make any changes at all, or you can make some changes to things that I'm not controlling. But in this particular case, I'm going to say none. I don't want them to allow them to make any changes. In this case, I'm also going to go in and turn off and on a couple different features, like the cameras. I'm going to disable them. I'm going to disable maybe some microphones on the device. I'm going to change the boot options. I'm going to maybe disable the ability to boot from USB. And then I now have this granular control down at that level. And now I'm going to go ahead and set that to an Azure Active Directory security group and be able to apply those settings so that when the device boots for the next time, it'll enforce these settings down onto the device. And I have that level of control. So this is now essentially allowing me to take more control over the actual firmware of the device and be able to essentially protect the device at a granular level. Now let's go ahead and verify those UEFI settings now. So now if I was to go in as a user, I could see that it's grayed out, and it would say that essentially my organization manages those settings. And we'd also see that I can't make any changes, like I can't turn off Secure Boot even if I wanted to. But if I was to actually go into the device itself, one of the things I would do is maybe go under Device Manager and open up a piece, because I want to say, why isn't there a camera on this device? And it would honestly say, we can't find your camera because there's no essential electricity going to it. This is going to be true even if you re-image the device. And I find that part fascinating. So if you were to re-image this device essentially maybe over an Intune command in order to reset the device, the UEFI settings don't get reset. And so you still have that essentially granular control, even if the device got re-imaged somehow. These settings are going to stay consistent into that space. So by the way, where did I find all of this? I found all of this on our Surface, we call it Explore Surface. And under Explore Surface, there's a great little web page called exploresurface.microsoft.com. I can come in here under an interactive guide, so I can kind of see how I have it. I have a couple different things around like autopilot, as well as my DFCI interactive guide. So I think this is a great place where if you wanted to come back and kind of walk through this yourself, just remember exploresurface.microsoft.com. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn it back to, I think we're moving along.
I think it's me. I get to talk about Secured Core PC. First of all,
Let's do
thank
it.
you, Frank, for that awesome demo. Just love diving into that. And now everyone here knows how to be a manager of 𝗦𝗲𝗳𝗀𝗳𝗏.
1000%.
Through DFCI. So let's talk a little bit about Secured Core PC. So this is a term that we use, admittedly it's a marketing term, to talk about a whole bunch of these kind of security processes and security toggles that are enabled by default on our devices. So since the Surface Pro 9 and the Surface Laptop 5 generation of devices, all Surface devices are Secured Core PCs. And that's super important because you see a Surface device, you know you can trust it. And there's a lot of things that kind of make this up. What I do want to just point out is that a hardware-backed root of trust is part of it. This essentially establishes those security measures like Frank talked about that are stored in that TPM. And so that's a key part of it. Some of our devices with like the Surface Pro 9 with 5G and some of our ARM-based devices do have a Pluton security processor as well. So it's awesome to have kind of that as one of the key things. It also has features like HBCI and VBS enabled by default for that virtualized-based security too. Something you want to add?
I always like to point out, some people ask, what's Pluton? Well, when you have the idea of system on chip, which is what all your phones essentially have, essentially it has more than just a CPU on it. It has a GPU and other memory capabilities and cache and other things like an I/O controller. Our devices have a similar design. I always say the trillions of dollars of investment that went into the phone industry have benefited these new Copilot Plus PCs, and one of them is the concept of system on chip. So system on chip allows us to take that TPM that was a discrete TPM in the past and actually move it into the silicon of our design and how we actually implement that. It used to be that you could actually make a claim that there was a vulnerability on a TPM where if you actually put some degree of a reader between essentially the wire line between the TPM and the CPU, you could actually read unencrypted information between that. That's certainly nation-state level kind of hacking that's taking place. I don't know that that's something, but in a commercial environment, we want to probably protect against that. So being able to move that TPM into the actual silicon, into the transistors level, that kind of eliminates that vulnerability that was there in the past.
Yeah, that's an awesome commentary to add, Frank. Thank you. I also just want to point out Windows Hello for Business as something that's on all of our Surface devices, as well as BitLocker, which is by default. All right, let's talk a little bit about protecting users and data. And so it's kind of along the same lines of that Secured Core PC. We have built-in protection that just allows people to do what they need to do to get stuff done. So that's those advanced Windows 11 Pro security features enabled by default. We've got biometric and passwordless authentication. And I think one of the most important things is something that you highlighted with our UEFI, but it's that all of this gets updated directly through Windows Update. And that point there, I feel like, is like one primary reason to adopt Surface. Everything comes through Windows Update. You don't need other tools.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to point out that, a number of years ago when there was this issue of Spectre and Meltdown, if we all remember way back a few years ago, it actually happened right before the holidays. There was a Google engineer that found out that there was a vulnerability of every chipset that was made by Intel and AMD and NVIDIA. Turned out they all had a similar design to them. And on that chipset, we would essentially have firmware or microcode that had to be changed. We had to update it somehow. Now, a lot of OEMs had these offline or utilities that you had to download and then be able to inject into the device. But on a Surface device, because we use Windows Update, we can actually send packages only at the operating system level, we send packages all the way down to the firmware and microcode level. So on the day that the Google engineer essentially put up the website announcing Spectre and Meltdown, we pushed automatically to every Surface device in the world that was accepting updates, an update that actually changed the microcode on the Intel processor. So I think that's a unique capability. There were actually some OEMs that used offline updaters, and one of those offline updaters actually had a virus in it, and I won't go out and talk about the OEM that ran into that, but there are vulnerabilities of using other IT tools that are outside the spectrum of Windows Update. It is a secured pathway in order to update our devices. We don't rely on other mechanisms in order to keep our devices up to date, and that's essentially a core to our modern management philosophy.
I love that story, Frank. Thank you for sharing it. What I do want to highlight here is this big slide that I do not expect folks to read. Really, the reason why we put it in here is just there's a ton of security features that Microsoft and Windows implement, and Surface adds on to those. And so I just want you to know that there's, just because we didn't mention something today does not mean that it doesn't exist on these great devices. So you can review this on your own time. But what I do want to highlight is how vital Windows Hello with ESS, or Enhanced Sign and Security, is. And I'm not going to drain this slide, but what I do want to highlight is when you think about exciting new Copilot Plus features that you may have heard announced on stage yesterday, or you may have seen live in our hands-on space up in the Copilot Plus PC showcase upstairs, one of the features that we're showcasing is actually recall. And I'm not going to go in depth about our new security posture on recall, but what I want to say is that there's plenty of blogs for you to dive in and understand how it's secured. But one of the things that they're doing is ensuring that anytime a user accesses that data, or if anyone was trying to access it from unauthorized sources, they would get blocked because it's in a VBS enclave that's secured with Windows Hello with Enhanced Sign and Security. So you have to auth every single time you're accessing that data, making a change to that data, and Windows Hello for Business is the only way to do that with ESS. So your facial recognition, your fingerprint on our Surface devices.
Or a PIN.
Or a PIN, you're right.
I always like to point out as well that Windows Hello enforces two-form factor authentication. You'd be like, well, it's only really one login just with my face or my fingerprint or my PIN, but it actually is two steps, because when you first enrolled your device into essentially Windows Hello, one of the things it did is you had to type in your username and password or provide essentially a secondary authentication in order to get onto the device the first time. One of the things that actually happened was a Azure Active Directory security key was downloaded off the internet from Microsoft and placed into the TPM chip in a secured vault on that TPM chip. When you actually have a facial recognition through infrared scan across your face, it actually goes and unlocks that authentication and that key that's sitting in the TPM to provide that second form factor of authentication. So it's super essentially efficient. We, within Microsoft, we use Windows Hello as our main way to get onto our devices. Microsoft probably having some of the more stricter security policies in order to protect our information, but we still drive forward with this amazing technology. It truly is magical to be able to just look at a machine. Literally, I've done this just even in order to get onto the demo that I just did on my own device here. I just had to look at it. I didn't have to type in anything in, and I was on two-form factor authentication.
And they probably didn't even realize that you were authenticating there.
Yeah, exactly.
We kind of talked about this, Frank, but maybe you want to add a little more.
Yeah, I think this is that example that if you ever have a Surface device, how many of you all have a Surface device out there? Oh, a good number. Look at that.
For those,
great audience.
For those online, it's about 60%, I'd say, or maybe even higher.
Thanks. So if you ever see a colored bar shooting across the bottom of your device, that's because we're updating the firmware on that device. We see firmware as probably the most, where our hackers are starting to pay the most amount of attention. Operating systems are fairly secure in one way or another, whether it's through agents and other pieces. But if you haven't taken essentially the approach to essentially protect your firmware, you'll find that organizations are targeting that. Because if the firmware is attacked, then the operating system will boot, and it will not even know that the firmware has been manipulated. For us, this is our ability to essentially set checksums on each of these different pieces of firmware, store those checksums essentially in the TPM OEM chip on the device, but we also have the ability to update each element of the firmware across the entire device. So along that line, not only are we always keeping the operating system up to date, we're keeping the firmware up to date at all times. Again, it's a big part of a security strategy with Surface devices to run always up to date. And that's a big thing as we drive forward on this. So I always like just to point out this very unique picture and some of the colored bars and what do those colored bars actually mean when you see them shooting across your device. I actually always take a little bit of joy knowing that the firmware level of my device is actually being protected and always being kept up to date. So
love that.
let's just keep moving.
Thanks for that. And I just want to point out that we're also rewriting our firmware in Rust. And so I know that's really big in the industry right now, and it's really important that we're taking that step for our devices and furthering the security of our firmware.
We have to scrape it off ships and then write it.
That's a good one. All right, let's talk about controlling our devices and providing ultimate control. So this is really about managing them. And so I want to talk about a few different solutions. One of them is our Surface management and support portals. These are awesome, newish offerings from Surface in the last couple of years. So if you have not heard of them, I'm going to go in a little bit more detail. But both solutions enable you to streamline your management and simplify the warranty and support process, as well as access some essential tools. So I'm going to give a demo in a moment, but I just want to point out that I'm not going to drain this slide. We've got the Surface management portal for those of you that are using Intune. And then for those of you that are not, we also have the Surface support portal. And so the management portal, if I go back to it, management portal is accessed in the Intune Admin Center.
I think that's a great example of how closely the Surface team as well as Windows team are working with the Intune team in order to bring unique solutions for Surface devices that aren't offered through other OEMs.
Yeah.
Other OEMs certainly have other ways that they manage something similar, but in this case, it's all through one single tool. If you have a M365 Admin Center and you launch Intune, you're going to see this tool available to you.
Absolutely, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. And I just want to point out the Surface support portal is for those that don't have Intune, you can access it in your Microsoft 365 Admin Center, just right there. Microsoft hardware support is present. It's a little less convenient because you have to include a log of your devices because Intune doesn't automatically know, or it doesn't automatically know what devices you have like it would if you had them enrolled in Intune, if that makes sense to you. All right, so let's, I also want to highlight the Surface IT Toolkit that brings a whole bunch of our essential commercial tools into modernized, streamlined experience. I'm going to give a quick demo instead of draining this slide, though. So if we go, I believe,
there it is.
Right here, I've got my great Surface laptop, 7th edition, on display here.
That's a 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗀𝗏PC.
Indeed it is.
With an ARM device, ARM processor.
Absolutely,
Qualcomm.
absolutely.
Snapdragon X Elite.
And in this case, I'm just accessing a browser here, so I'm not taking advantage of any of that great on-device AI processing. But what we do have is, sure enough, Intune.Microsoft.com. If you have any Surface devices that in your environment, even if it's only one Surface device, you go here to All Services, you can see the Surface Management Portal right here. And I just like pointing that out because a few people came by yesterday and they were like, hey, I want to learn more about this. And they're like a Lenovo shop or they're using other OEMs. And I said, do you have any Surface devices that are managed? And they said, oh yeah, our exec has one. I was like, yep, you can go in and click around and see for yourself. So this is, I will say, quite a messy environment here. We use this for some of our kind of playground and testing and stuff like that.
Surface Duo 2.
Yeah, so we've got some devices in here that I just want to highlight a few things. We've got an overview of things, some insights on devices, some support, the ability to make service orders, IT tools, which I'll highlight in a second, as well as carbon emissions.
I love the carbon emissions one because it essentially will show you based on your entire inventory the amount of carbon that inventory is taking up. So if you're applying for carbon credits and other pieces, this is a great proof tool in order to showcase that.
Totally, and you can easily go and set to kind of get more detailed information about how we're making these assumptions and what assumptions we're making. I do like pointing out that in Insights here, I've got 9 devices that are eligible for a Windows 11 update. Oh, that's amazing. That's good. I should probably get those updated. And if not, I should probably—
The clock is ticking.
Yeah.
Does everybody remember the date? I think Microsoft's made it pretty clear, right?
October
2025.
2025. Yep, exactly. There's our plug there. And then I've also got 7 devices that's warranty is expiring within 60 days, so I should probably refresh some of my fleet with some new Copilot Plus devices.
I think that'd be a great idea.
All right, so again, I'm not going to drain everything here, but one thing that's linked is the Surface IT Toolkit, which gives a ton of things on a local install for an IT admin to do on their own device to help them manage their fleet of devices. And so here I've downloaded the Surface IT Toolkit. It's a really awesome MSIX app that is self-updating and always has the latest tools. And so
maybe we can find how to get an image for a device.
ooh, that's a good idea. That's a process that used to be
You'd have to go to a website, type in a serial number.
Yeah, it can get a little clunky, and then, yeah, exactly. So if we go down to Recovery Tool, there's more than just this in the tool, but I'll just showcase how easy it is to create a USB key if I do want to reset a device. So I've already chosen the devices that I manage in my fleet. So I selected on first install that I've got Surface Pro 11th editions, Surface Pro 10, but in this case I want to re-image a Surface Pro 9. And what's awesome about this is I can choose from whatever available recovery images exist. So I don't have to just choose the first one that was available on the device. In this case, I can choose both a Windows 10 or Windows 11 image. Of course, I'm going to choose a Windows 11 image based on my message.
Right.
And it's got the 22H2 version
Latest.
of Windows 11.
Yep.
Yeah, in this case, it's not the latest necessarily that's available now, but it's the latest as of the time that we provided this authentication, essentially, for recovery image. So
sometimes we call it a BMR.
Yeah.
Bare metal recovery image.
Exactly. You want that device to get back to that known, guaranteed kind of working state.
Right.
And so I can go through and also add in language packs, which is super cool and something you couldn't do before. I know we're pretty in the weeds here, but what I just want to highlight is that you can have this level of control and this level of convenience in this IT toolkit, and it wasn't present before. So just wanted to highlight that for a little bit. I think we can head back to kind of close with a couple of quick thoughts. There we go. How about you close us out, Frank?
Yeah, so we essentially live by this within the Secure Pete, that we built secure, we trusted every layer, we protect our users and data with ultimate control, especially ultimate control through the cloud. Our concept here is that these devices are one solution from Microsoft. They are always up to date, and we're able to essentially control all of that update through single unified tools, whether that be Windows Update, whether that be through the Surface Management Portal that is part of Intune, or be able to have a single pane of glass to manage all your devices using a single piece. One of the things that I always like to point out here is when I'm talking to a lot of customers about Surface devices, we also enforce the idea that it's running one security agent. We essentially believe in the idea that an E5 license or even an E3 license with Windows Defender has the ultimate protection. I always like to point out that nobody other than Microsoft understands the threats and vulnerabilities of Windows and Surface devices than Microsoft themselves. You can go out and put a lot of different agents on your device, and they're essentially working towards keeping the devices up to date. And they do a very good job of that. But within Microsoft, I go back to that idea that every problem is a Surface problem, and that includes essentially this concept of keeping the device up to date. For us to be able to essentially use this intelligent network to understand what the threats and vulnerabilities that we're seeing across the globe, to quickly work within an internal system in order to find the problem, resolve the problem, and push out the fix for that problem, that all happens essentially within one ecosystem of Microsoft. We don't have to work with another vendor for the operating system, or the firmware, or the management tools. Look at all the other devices in the market space, and could you truly say that that is a single solution? Maybe your other solutions have hardware from one, software from another, applications from another. Within Microsoft, it's this single vision towards how we define that. And we're able to essentially keep these devices up to date with a single agent. And that allows for better performance of the device all up. So for that, we would say that that is essentially a singular vision that we have for Microsoft Surface devices. So
I love it.
What's our next steps? Why don't you go ahead and close this out with the call
I
to
think
action?
we want to take some Q&A in a moment, but I want to make sure that we don't lose the group while we do so. So let's talk about next steps. We've got, first of all, explore some of our devices in the 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 space. Chat with Frank and I, and 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 and Gnid and others from our team and our extended team. We've got folks on the engineering side. We've got folks that can go deep in certain areas. We're happy to have
Well, we want you to make sure you come by, because while 𝗦𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 gave a great session yesterday that you may have attended or not, and we even want people to go out and explore these devices through our websites for all of the great attendees that are attending digitally. But if you're here in person, please stop by so we can show you Click to Do, we can show you a recall demo, we can show you enhanced search on Windows devices, all these capabilities to provide essentially even Windows and the ability to provide the voice clarity and essentially finding your voice in a field of voices. There's some great demos to be able to take part in. And for those that are online, know that we have that covered in our Surface websites as well.
Yeah, explore surface.microsoft.com. That's
there we
a
go.
great way to experience that. We also have a session that you can watch yesterday's that 𝗦𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 led and Jack Cowett, one of our engineering directors, led. That's BRK294. But we've got 295 this afternoon that we're showcasing the Surface Hub 3.
And I would give a big plug for that one, because it's going to be super interactive. We're going to have 2 Surface Hubs on the stage, and we're going to have just a lot of interaction with that, showcasing a new console that will actually attach to the device, plus some really cool demonstrations of this amazing Surface Hub technology.
For those of you that got up early for the security session, you got a preview there. I love it. And then, of course, please follow our blog at the Surface IT Pro blog, as well as see our technical documentation, aka.mesh/Surface Docs. Right. Let's take some Q&A. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Folks have any questions? Are there any questions online? Come step up to the microphone if you would like.
All right.
We will do our best.
Hi. My question is regarding BitLocker PIN, basically. Unfortunately, we are forced to use that since we have in pen testing been able to hack our non-Surface devices. We haven't tested this on Surfaces, to be honest, but what is your view on the requirement going forward for BitLocker PIN to be absolutely safe if we use a Surface? Preferable the new ones with ARM devices.
I think one of the reasons I find that BitLocker is a strong, kind of not only suggestion, but to me a requirement, is the idea that SSDs are now removable, and essentially you can simply take an SSD out of a device and maybe put it into another device, but if it's not essentially BitLockered, anybody could essentially steal the entire contents. But being able to put BitLocker on that SSD now locks that down, so that if you did move it to another device, you'd have to type in the BitLocker key. What I also love is these keys are available within Azure Active Directory in order for you to, issue to your employees if they forgot what their BitLocker was. So maybe.
Talking about unlocking BitLocker.
The actual PIN.
Yeah. So like first boot up PIN.
Chauncey, can you use the microphone there? Thank you. And you might need to turn it on at the top there.
There we go. Hey. So he's talking more about the PIN to unlock. So it would be a pre-boot PIN before you even get into Windows.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of that is in place in order to address some of the bigger concerns around, like I think TPM, which frankly are pretty light. There's definitely a balance you have to do as an organization right now, which is, I think as Microsoft, as Windows, we always envision Windows Hello for business and the security that we put in place in order to kind of protect against, some of the big things out there are going to help, I think, mitigate most of those. But as an organization, if you feel that you need to have that extra PIN, it's available. Unfortunately, that does impact end user experience, right? And that's core to Surface. We're always going to kind of drive towards that end user experience. One thing I will say is, as you start to see Pluton become more available, Pluton will help address some of that stuff, because you effectively kind of help remove some of that TPM concern around the kind of the risk there. So as that becomes more of a prevalent thing in the commercial space in particular, I think that might be able to address that in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chauncey.
Good question.
Great question.
Morning, guys.
Good morning.
So you mentioned that the settings for the UEFI that you configure in Intune will persist even after you re-image the device. So an attacker would need to re-enroll it into Intune in order to manipulate those settings. Let's say somebody stole the device and
They can't just re-enroll it because it's enrolled.
but if they had re-imaged it or reset it, then
It would still be owned by the tenant because if you lock what I really like about DFCI is once you take control over it and put the setting on it that says nobody can manage any settings essentially, then even if the device was ever re-imaged, the device is still tied to the tenant. We've actually had this issue in a couple times with when we loan people devices. They will actually enroll it into their tenant, and then we'll take the device back, and then we'll find that we need to get them and to release that device from their tenant. Because even if you re-image the device, it's still enrolled in their tenant as being managed at a UFI level by that tenant.
And I see on Reddit or other forums online, people will buy a device, a Surface device exclusively, and they'll get it and they'll be all excited and they go, hey, my device, I can't even boot it from USB, I can't do anything to it, I bought it used, and everyone is unanimous in agreement, there's nothing you can do. Like you're out of luck, you gotta go back to who you bought it from and get them to unenroll it, probably a stolen device.
Yeah.
cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
So my organization has kind of started transitioning about a year ago from our Lenovo's over to Surfaces. So we have a mix of laptop 5s and laptop 6s now. One thing that we wanted to know is as we transition to this passwordless, mindset, is the Windows Hello for Business with ESS something that's tied to Surface in particular, or is that something that is basically enabled if you have like TPM 2.0, Windows 11, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's more into it than I can claim to fully explain, but it is not just exclusive to Surface. So it is present on other devices, but I do want to point out is that all of our devices do have great Windows Hello cameras, or all of our Copilot Plus PCs do as well. And there was one other thing I wanted to point out that I just forgot.
I always like to point out that Surface and Hello were kind of built together. We were kind of at the forefront of bringing that technology, and as we continue to evolve, I always like to point out that the development of these pieces of code are actually developed on Surface devices, like our own core developers when they're developing these new experiences. So what you have is probably the best example. Now we share that throughout the rest of our Windows ecosystem, so everybody benefits from it. But in this case, we make sure it runs on Surface first. So.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.
Good morning. We
Good
have
morning.
about 30 plus Surface devices that are running a specialized profile, so no admin privileges on them. And was wondering if there's a way to run the Surface Diagnostic Toolkit, like push it out, run it via Intune, and get those diagnostics back.
So SDT can't be run locally because they're not an admin on their device?
Correct.
Oh, that's a question that I don't know if I can get in the weeds on. Chauncey, do you happen to know the answer?
We'll get.
Yeah, we're gonna have to follow up with you on that because I'm not.
Maybe maybe we can get your name at the end, and we can follow back up with you.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
What
so
did it
You
do?
stumped us.
Yeah, because aside from doing an autopilot reset under a different profile, gaining admin privileges on it, and running the.
That's a great. I mean, yeah, it's a
At that
great
point,
idea.
It might have fixed the issue.
Yep,
Right.
totally.
Or doing an autopilot reset and just redeploying to the
Right.
computer. So just trying to figure out how do we.
Seems like remote desktop, but then your users you just want to be able to literally run it as almost like a startup or as a admin level privilege to run that.
Yeah, but we have no admin privileges on the devices.
Right.
Yeah, it's local. There is a new capability that Pavan just announced yesterday, 2 days ago, whenever that was. That's basically like just-in-time admin. That's not the term, by the way. I don't know in particular, but like I think that might be able to address what that is.
Yep.
But let's follow up with that. That's a good, solid question.
All right, we got one more minute, and then the music's going to start playing. So,
Morning.
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 With Windows Hello, is there an option to have the PIN be set to change every 90 days like we do for passwords, just so it's not a set constant?
Oh, is that an Intune policy that you could enforce? That's the second one you've stumped me on.
Yep, that's one that I don't know either. Rotating pins.
Copilot.
Yeah, I feel like there's a simple answer, but I don't have the simple answer at my fingertips.
Or is there a way to disable the pin and just allow for the image for a hello?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Because not that I'm aware of.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can.
Technically entropy, but I can see what you're saying. Yeah.
We'll have to follow up with you on that one too.
We should go talk to the Windows folks about that because they have a solid
Yeah.
conversation around that for sure.
There's probably some experts that we can even find out on the floor that actually knows that start of it. But yes, want to admit that that's one we're going to have to follow up on.
Thanks.
So thanks.
Yeah.
All right, I think we got 10 seconds before the music's going to say. We want to thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Ignite. And, feel free. We'll be out in the hall probably answering some questions if you want to stop by and talk to us.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you.